What happens when the company's store has an orbital dock, a private navy, a fusion reactor, and your entire planet's oxygen supply on subscription? Science fiction loves megacorporations. Sometimes it's the shadowy company sending miners and truckers into the dark. Sometimes it is a trade combine whose stockholders include emperors and noble houses. Sometimes it is a human corporation stripping an alien moon for rare materials, or a clean white corporate utopia where the logo smiles at you while the security drones remind you not to loiter near the airlock. And needless to say, when a story wants us to feel uneasy, there are a few faster ways to do it than putting a corporate logo on a spaceship. But the reason megacorporations show up so often in space fiction is not just that writers enjoy villains with expense accounts. Space really does favor giant institutions. There are roles for small businesses and rugged loners and individualists, but space development favors organizations that can raise absurd amounts of capital, wait decades for a payoff, absorb risk, build infrastructure before customers exist, and coordinate supply chains across distances where even light takes minutes, hours, or years to arrive. So today we are going to look at megacorporations in space, why it appears so often in science fiction, why some versions make good economic sense, where other versions break down, and what role corporate power might actually play in settling the solar system and eventually the stars. We will assume for most of this episode that some form of capitalism or mercantilism, markets, ownership, investment, and trade remains in play. That may not be true forever. There may be futures where money fades, where automation makes most ordinary goods effectively free, or where civilization organizes itself through reputation, public planning, AI coordination, gift economies, or some system we do not have a good word for yet. We have discussed that more directly before in our episode on a future without money, and we will return to that possibility near the end with Star Trek and the culture. I should also note that when we say corporation, we usually mean a for-profit business corporation, but the older meaning of the word is broader. A corporation is a group legally treated as a continuing body, distinct from individual people who happen to belong to it at any given time. It can own property, make contracts, sue and be sued, and survive changes in membership. In that sense, a town, university, monastery, guild, church, charity, village government, or trading company can all be corporations. That older meaning matters for this episode because space may revive some very old institutional forms. A corporation does not have to be just a business selling products to customers. It might be a chartered colony, a trade company, a habitat authority, a port operator, a church mission, a university expedition, or a city in the making. You can sign a contract with a church, sue a town, lease land from a university, or buy shares in a trading company, even though none of those are simply people in the ordinary sense. The law treats them as enduring bodies so they can act, own, borrow, promise, and be held responsible across generations. In a civil court anyway, criminal charges still go to individual people. A corporation itself, lacking an actual mind, cannot have mens rea, or criminal-minded intent. We could imagine a future corporate AI that could, though. But the modern for-profit corporation is a later specialization of that order idea, and science fiction often returns to something closer to the order model, a chartered company that trades, builds infrastructure, governs territory, hires security, settles colonies, and gradually forgets where commerce ends and sovereignty begins. So yes, we will be mostly talking about for-profit companies today, but not exclusively. We also need to remember that large organizations often develop goals for beyond simple profit. Strictly speaking, a corporation does not have motives of its own, unless perhaps we someday do create an AI-managed company that truly functions like a corporate mind. But the people, rules, incentives, traditions, and internal culture of an institution can still make it behave as though it has a personality. Some companies are founded only to make money, others begin with larger purposes, building a railroad, opening a trade route, settling a frontier, spreading a faith, advancing science, or founding a new society. A chartered space colony might need to turn a profit simply to pay off the enormous debt incurred buying ships, habitats, reactors, and life support systems. But its deeper goal might be to build a world, a city, or even a new nation. That is where the space megacorporation becomes especially interesting. It may not just be a business in space, but a seed from which whole civilizations grow. They will likely come in many formats with many goals and behaviors, but for now, let's be on the most famous desert in science fiction. In Dune, the most important corporation in the known universe is not exactly a rocket company, a weapons manufacturer, or a bank. It is CHOAM, the Combine Honet Ober Advancer Mercantiles, a vast interstellar trade combine whose shares are held by the Emperor, the Great Houses, and other powers of the Imperium. CHOAM is not simply a business operating inside the government. It is one of the main ways power is distributed in that civilization. Political authority, noble privilege, and commercial profit are all braided together. And then there is melange, the spice. Melange is one of the cleanest fictional examples of a strategic bottleneck resource. It extends life, enhances awareness, underwrites elite power, and most importantly, makes safe interstellar navigation possible through the Spacing Guild. It is found on one planet, Arrakis, under incredibly hostile conditions, and no substitute exists for most of the story. That means whoever controls Arrakis does not merely own a valuable mine, they hold a hand around the throat of civilization. That is the central economic logic of Dune. It is not that CHOAM is a normal company that got very big, or effectively an incorporated stock market. It is that the whole interstellar economy depends on a commodity that is scarce, irreplaceable, geographically concentrated, and politically entangled. On Earth, we have seen milder versions of this with salt, silver, spices, whale oil, rubber, uranium, semiconductors, rare earth refining, and critical shipping choke points. None of those perfectly maps to melange, but the underlying idea is familiar. If a civilization cannot function without something, and that something can be controlled, then the controller becomes more than a merchant. The flaw in Dune's logic, at least from a hard economic perspective, is the monopolies that total tend to invite substitution, smuggling, war, political seizure, or technological workarounds. If your whole civilization depends on one material from one planet, every brilliant chemist, physicist, black market trader, rival empire, and desperate reformer should be trying to break that dependency. And yet, in the opening of the first book, everyone has failed for over 10,000 years. Dune does address this in various ways, especially through politics, religion, ecology, and the guild's own interests. But in reality, a spice monopoly that lasted thousands of years will require not just scarcity, but active suppression of alternatives. That said, as a model of space megacorporate power, Dune works beautifully. It reminds us that the real prize might not be owning planets, maybe owning bottlenecks. There are different kinds of monopoly, and space can produce all of them. A legal monopoly exists because a government or charter grants exclusive rights, as with old trading companies or state-backed concessions. A natural monopoly exists because duplicating the infrastructure is so expensive or inefficient that one network tends to dominate, as with railroads, power grids, ports, or maybe someday space elevators, mass drivers, wormhole gates, or beamed power networks. And then there is a practical monopoly, where competition might technically exist, but not in a useful way for the person trapped inside the system. If your habitat has one oxygen supplier, one docking port, one bank, one court, one affordable ride home, then you are free to choose another provider becomes more of a joke than a market principle. That distinction matters because future space megacorps might not need to own everything to control everything. They might only need to own the choke point, the launch system, the transit route, the local reactor, the habitat shell, the navigation network, the only repair yard, or the only way to get cargo and people safely from one world to another. On paper, everyone else may still be independent. In practice, they're all paying tolls to the same gatekeeper. The Expanse gives us a more near-term and probably more realistic model, depending on if we're talking about the novels or the TV show. Corporations in the Expanse do not replace governments entirely. Earth, Mars, and the Belt all have political structures, militaries, laws, propaganda, factions, and grievances. But corporations are everywhere in the machinery. They mine asteroids, build ships, operate stations, manage logistics, supply militaries, and sometimes conduct research so dangerous that even the government involved would rather not leave fingerprints on it. This is probably closer to what we would expect in the early centuries of space development, not corporations versus governments, but corporations entwined with governments. The company gets the contract, the government gets deniability, jobs, strategic capability, tax revenue, and someone else to blame when the reactor leaks, the workers riot, or the alien protomolecule starts doing things that would make any sensible insurance company quietly fake its own death. Historically, this is not strange. The British East India Company, Dutch East India Company, Hudson's Bay Company, railroad corporations, fruit companies, defense contractors, oil companies, and chartered colonial enterprises all showed different pieces of this pattern. They were not merely shops selling goods or companies wealthy enough to influence the government. They were often de facto wings of the government, or the ruling powers anyway. They built infrastructure, controlled territory, shaped laws, influenced diplomacy, hired armed men, and often actually ran government agencies, and in turn often had their governing boards filled with previous senior officials from the government. The expanse works because space makes those old patterns more intense. A mining station in the belt is not a town with bad roads and one company's store. It is a sealed machine in vacuum. If the company controls employment, housing, water, air, docking, shipping, medical care, and communications, then private sector and public authority begin to blur. A worker cannot simply walk to the next town when the next town is 10 million kilometers away and the ticket costs more than his annual income. Now, those settings often fail on realism by assuming some implausible scarcity. Oxygen and water should simply never be in short supply in any interplanetary civilization. Those could be substituted for other potential resources that might be hard to fill, like computer processing power and chips, but we'll give that a pass as highlighting a resource that the audience can see and feel emotionally. Mass Effect gives us another useful variation, because its universe has corporations, mercenary outfits, colonial interests, research firms, and galactic institutions all operating under the shadow of mass relays. The relays change the economics dramatically. They make interstellar travel fast enough that trade, migration, military response, and corporate management across star systems all become plausible. Without those relays, an interstellar corporation has a nightmarish coordination problem. With them, it can start to look more like a multinational corporation with better scenery and more things trying to eat the survey team. Mass Effect also shows a future where megacorporate behavior depends heavily on jurisdiction. In the settled core, laws, councils, governments, and reputation constrain companies. Out in the terminus system or frontier colonies, things get looser. That is a very believable pattern. The frontier is where oversight thins out, where local security becomes more important, where desperate colonists accept bad contracts, and where research station becomes a phrase that should make every genre-rare person reach for a shotgun. The economic logic in Mass Effect works best because it has fast transport and communications. Once you give a civilization mass relays, wormholes, jump gates, or some equivalent, interstellar commerce becomes far more plausible. The flaw is that the relays are so central that whoever controls them should dominate everything. In that sense, the true megacorporation of such a setting might not be the mining firm or weapons manufacturer. It would be whoever owns, regulates, maintains, or can deny access to the transit network. The spaceport is valuable. The railroad is better. The only bridge across the galaxy is priceless. The same would tend to apply to anyone who had wormhole networks or stargates. Alien gives us the darker blue-collar version of this. Weyland-Yutani is not frightening because it has a fancy boardroom. It is frightening because its employees are isolated, expendable, and often do not know the real mission. The crew of the Nostromo are basically space truckers, and that is part of the horror. These are not grand admirals or psychic emperors. They are working people inside a machine they do not control, carrying cargo for a company whose priorities may not include their continued possession of internal organs. This is one of the most realistic dangers of corporate space exploration, not the xenomorph, one hopes, though I am not making promises about what lurks under Europa's ice, but the incentive structure itself. Exploration produces discoveries. Discoveries produce valuable information. Valuable information produces secrecy. Secrecy produces bad decisions. Bad decisions in space produce funerals. A company exploring distant moons, derelict alien ships, subsurface oceans, or weird biospheres might face a terrible temptation to downplay risks. Bring the sample aboard. Continue the mission. Do not alert competitors. Do not panic the market. Do not inform the crew until they need to know. And good news, they will probably never need to know, because the legal department has determined that digestion by alien organisms is outside the standard compensation package. The flaw in Weyland-Yutani-style logic is that companies that keep losing crews, ships, and colonies should eventually face massive legal, financial, military, and reputational consequences, unless the state is weak, captured, corrupt, or too far away to enforce anything. And frequently, a weak government that's puppet to corporations is still a force to be reckoned with, because it is a tool corporations will be using for attacking each other. Not to mention that puppet rulers tend to try to pull their own strings sometimes. But for Alien, it works because it seems plausible where oversight is delayed, information is controlled, and the company is powerful enough to treat disasters as classified research expenses. Avatar and the RDA give us the extraction megacore. It is not subtle, but it is useful. The Resource Development Administration crosses interstellar distances to mine unobtainium from Pandora, and when local ecology and inhabitants object, the company behaves like the worst version of a colonial mining enterprise with a high-tech military. The historical parallels are obvious: colonial resource extraction, company towns, plantation economies, chartered monopolies, and private military force. Space can make that pattern better or worse depending on what we find. If most space is lifeless rock, then extraction is ethically simpler, though still not automatically harmless. Mining an asteroid is not the same as bulldozing a rainforest, let alone one occupied by another intelligent alien species. And we find living worlds, alien ecologies, native biospheres, or technological civilizations, then the corporate extraction model becomes morally explosive. The flaw in Avatar is the economics are astonishingly extreme. Interstellar extraction of bulk materials is usually hard to justify. If you need a mineral, it is probably cheaper to find or synthesize it somewhere closer, unless it is truly unique, incredibly valuable, and impossible to manufacture. The more realistic version is not hauling ordinary ore across the stars, though that can be economically viable to fuel Cartership 2 civilizations. Rather, it is acquiring something like biological knowledge, exotic materials, alien artifacts, or access to a unique environment. In other words, not we crossed interstellar space for rocks, but we crossed interstellar space for something that cannot be found in our own solar system at any price. Neuromancer, Shadowrun, Snow Crash, and Blade Runner-style cyberpunk settings give us a sovereign megacore. The company has a state, culture, employer, landlord, police force, and personal identity. These worlds often imagine corporations with extraterritorial rights, private armies, corporate citizenship, and employees whose loyalty resembles patriotism. Space makes that idea more physically plausible. On Earth, a corporate enclave still sits inside a broader biosphere. You can leave the building, cross a street, disappear into a city, sue in a court, call a journalist, or at least breathe the air without reading the terms of service. In a space habitat, a ship, or an asteroid colony, the corporation may own the walls. It may own the crops, radiators, water tanks, medical bay, docking rights, and the software that balances oxygen levels while everyone sleeps. That does not mean corporate habitats would automatically be dystopias. A well-run company town can be safer, cleaner, and more efficient than a chaotic settlement. Corporate towns back in the day often were a nicer place to live than their less organized neighbors. Early space colonies may actively prefer centralized management because mistakes are deadly. Someone has to maintain the seals, inspect the farms, allocate power, schedule docking, monitor disease, and make sure no one decides that amateur fireworks are a basic human right inside a pressurized cylinder. But the danger is obvious. When your employer is also your landlord, utility provider, court system, internet provider, bank, grocery store, school board, and ride home, quitting becomes a philosophical concept only. This becomes identical to space feudalism at that point, which we also have an episode on. There are many other fictional shoutouts we could make in passing. RoboCop's Omni Consumer Products is a classic corporate government merger. Total Recall gives us Mars as a corporate-controlled frontier of air and labor. EVE Online takes corporate sovereignty and turns into an actual player-run space empire. The Outer Worlds practically builds a cathedral to the absurdity of company-town capitalism among the stars. Firefly gives us the corporate state alliance and the neglected frontier. Even Star Wars, the Trade Federation and corporate guilds, shows the old idea that commercial power can become military and political power if left to metastasize long enough. Less often, but probably equally valid, would be examples where the companies act as a check and balance on powerful local lords, feudal empires, frontier strongmen, or weaker corrupt local governments. Find me a powerful institution, company, church, state, take your pick, and I can show you examples of misbehaving or being the check and balance on others doing so. Wherever you can concentrate power and leverage, you can get a tool that can be wielded, and those wielding decide if that's for good or selfish reasons. I think we can't expect every type of organization in space, but megacorporations seem particularly plausible, and the common thread is infrastructure. Space megacorps are not plausible because logos become magical in zero gravity. They are plausible because space settlement requires enormous, capital-intensive systems before ordinary life can happen. Consider building a routine space habitat, not a little station, but a true settlement, an O'Neill cylinder, Stanford Taurus, Bishop Ring, or some smaller earlier version meant for thousands or millions of people. A company or consortium would need raw materials, probably from the moon or asteroids. It would need construction yards, robotics, power stations, radiators, mirrors, farms, life support, docking facilities, shielding, spin systems, emergency shelters, traffic control, legal charters, insurance, finance, and customers willing to move into a place where bad plumbing can become Everyone Dies Wednesday. How would such a company make money? It might sell residential units, lease industrial space, charge docking fees, sell power, rent agricultural capacity, operate data centers, host laboratories, provide tourism, run schools and hospitals, sell naming rights, and retain control of utilities. It might pre-sell plots the way developers sell condos before a building is finished. It might issue bonds backed by future lease revenue. It might bring in anchor tenants, a university, a national space agency, a chip manufacturer, a pharmaceutical lab, a shipyard, a hotel chain, or a government that wants strategic presence without building the whole habitat itself. Now that sounds exotic, but it's not entirely alien. We already finance cities, ports, airports, railroads, power plants, ships, factories, and plant communities through combinations of debt, equity, public subsidies, private investment, advanced purchase agreements, and long-term contracts. A space habitat is stranger, but the financial skeleton is recognizable. The main difference is scale and coupling. A bad shopping mall can sit half empty and struggle along, but a bad habitat cannot run half its life support. Many costs are fixed. You need shielding whether the first residents arrive or not. You need station keeping, maintenance crews, emergency systems, and governance before the place has a vibrant coffee scene. This makes early habitats especially likely to be built by very large institutions. Governments, megacorps, sovereign wealth funds, billionaire dynasties, religious movements, public-private partnerships, or coalitions of all the above. And this is where the positive case for megacorps matters. It is easy to sneer at large corporations, and sometimes it is recreationally satisfying. But big organizations are not merely villains. They can mobilize capital, they can standardize designs, they can survive early failures, they can coordinate suppliers, they can build boring, repeatable, safe systems. They can turn heroic exploration into routine logistics, and routine logistics is how civilizations actually grow. The first permanent space settlements may not be founded by poets and rugged individualists with chrome shovels. They may be founded by procurement departments, bond markets, construction robots, pension funds, and liability lawyers. That is less romantic, but is also how you get pressure doors that close properly. In the solar system, the return on investment can at least be imagined. Mining asteroids for metals may eventually serve in-space industry. Lunar fuel, oxygen, and metals might support orbital construction. Orbital solar power could beam energy. Microgravity manufacturing might produce valuable materials. pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, fiber optics, crystals, or biological products. Space tourism could help bootstrap infrastructure. Defense contracts could underwrite launch systems. Data centers might use cooled radiators and abundant solar power. Habitats could sell residence, prestige, tax advantages, research access, or simply room for people who want a different life. Some of these businesses will fail. Many will fail. Space is an excellent place to discover that a PowerPoint deck is not a business model, and I've seen a lot of those for space companies over the years, and sometimes find myself wondering how someone as smart as a rocket scientist can be so bad at business concepts. But the basic idea is sound. If economic activity grows in orbit, on the moon, around Mars, among asteroids, and eventually in the outer system, then large corporations will probably be among the builders. The case for interstellar colonies is far harder. A company investing in Mars might wait 20 years for meaningful returns. That is painful, but not absurd, especially if it's partially supplemented by governments wanting the prestige of a space settlement and a public willing to chip in. But a company investing in a colony around Tau Ceti may wait centuries before any material return arrives, and that assumes return trade makes sense at all. If the colony is 12 light years away, even information takes 12 years one way. Cargo may take decades or centuries. Shareholders tend to get cranky when the dividend estimate says, "Ask your cryopreserved great-grandchildren." This is why interstellar megacores require special assumptions. They might be run by long-lived or immortal people. They might be AI-managed trusts with century-scale mandates. They might be backed by governments seeking strategic expansion. They might be ideological, religious, philanthropic, or civilizational backup projects wearing corporate clothing. Indeed, I tend to think a lot of space colony chartered corporations will be affiliated and partially funded by some political ideology or religion that wants to found their utopia, and the board is made of the members who have the business acumen to make that economically sane enough to attract investors from inside the movement and even investors or valuable colonists from outside it too. They might sell not cargo but rights, naming rights, intellectual property, future claims, cultural prestige, insurance against extinction, or data from alien biospheres. They might auction off things like control of a chunk of the AM radio band planet-wide, or agree to let some company provide 25% of the deuterium needs per year on a 1,000-year contract. And they might not be corporations in the modern sense at all, but chartered institutions more like universities, monasteries, colonial companies, dynastic foundations, or sovereign development banks, or hybrids thereof. Now, this is where science fiction often cheats by giving us faster light travel. Add a mass relay, warp drive, jump gate, Holtzman drive, wormhole, or hyperspace route, and suddenly the economic logic changes. Interstellar trade can become more like maritime trade or air freight. Without FTL or extreme longevity, interstellar capitalism becomes very strange. With FTL, the East India Company can grow tentacles and buy a star map. That brings us to checks and balances. The danger of a space megacore is not simply that it seeks profit. Profit is a useful signal. It tells us, imperfectly but powerfully, that people value what is being produced more than the resources consumed to produce it. The danger is monopoly, coercion, fraud, political capture, and a lack of exit. Those are problems on Earth. In space, they become sharper because survival depends on infrastructure. There is no living off the land as a classic pioneer, except in such cases where everyone has casual access to nanobot assemblers and replicators, which could be the case. See our Hermit Hypothesis episode. That has its own problems, but otherwise you are dependent on high-tech infrastructure from day one. There's no log cabin or forging off the land. Whoever built and controls that infrastructure has great power. I would assume the best protection is not just a law written on Earth by people who have never smelled a failing algae tank. Laws matter, but enforcement matters more. A habitat constitution matters. Independent courts matter. Transparent contracts matter. Worker associations, guilds, unions, insurance standards, open technical protocols, public inspection regimes, antitrust rules, and emergency rights all matter. But perhaps the deepest check is redundancy. If there is only one oxygen supplier, one docking port, one security force, one court, one employer, one bank, one communications channel, and one ship home, then freedom exists mostly as a decorative word in the brochure. If there are multiple habitats, competing transport lines, open docking standards, portable residency rights, independent life support audits, mutual aid treaties, and the practical ability to leave, then corporate power is constrained. The old frontier phrase was "go west." The space version may be "have somewhere else to dock." There is also a role for public infrastructure. Some things may be too important to leave entirely in private hands, especially our natural monopolies: launch loops, beam power networks, major traffic control systems, planetary defenses, mass drivers, space elevators, core navigation networks, emergency rescue fleets, and maybe the basic legal framework for habitat rights. A civilization may decide that private companies can build and operate many pieces, but that no single company should own the only bridge, the only air supply, or the only court. At the same time, too much public control can create its own failures: stagnation, bureaucracy, politicized allocation, corruption, and projects that survive because they have patrons rather than customers. It is hard to say, and your mileage may vary, but the healthiest future is probably a mixed one. Private initiative, public oversight, open standards, competition, and enough institutional diversity that no single failure mode captures everything. A key thing in this discussion to remember, though, is that space is truly enormous, with trillions of worlds in this galaxy alone, without even considering asteroids, moons, and space habitats. That's a lot of room to try out different approaches to economics and governance. And potentially even bad systems can stick around, as in a post-scarcity environment, there's less pressure to kick a failing system to the curb, as no one is starving to death or living in squalor in even the most incompetently run post-scarcity civilization. But on the matter of post-scarcity setups, we get some interesting possible alternatives to corporations. Star Trek is the gentler contrast. Inside the Federation, money appears to be much less central, at least for ordinary citizens and ordinary goods. It varies by era and writer if they even have money. People do not seem to work primarily to avoid starvation or rent. Replicators, automation, abundant energy, and a strong civic culture have reduced many forms of scarcity. But large institutions have not vanished. Starfleet exists, shipyards exist, planetary governments exist, research institutes, diplomatic bodies, exploration programs, and legal systems exist. Coordination remains necessary even when hunger does not. Now, Star Trek is often inconsistent and implausible in its setups, but then actual real-life systems often are too, or at least seem that way. So in a Star Trek-like future, classic corporations may fade in the core worlds because people no longer need private employers to organize basic production. But corporate-like entities may persist at the edges: freighter companies, mining outfits, trading houses, design firms, entertainment brands, research ventures, or frontier development groups. Scarcity does not vanish in all forms and everywhere at once, nor does ambition, status, risk, curiosity, or bad judgment, which are among humanity's most renewable resources. The Culture from E&M Banks pushes the contrast further. In The Culture, artificial minds, immense automation, and material abundance make the classic corporation almost unnecessary. There is no normal labor market to dominate, no desperate consumer base to exploit, no shareholder class demanding quarterly dividends, and no obvious reason to own a factory when the factories can be made by systems smarter than your entire board of directors and less likely to schedule a motivational retreat. Yet the Culture still has enormous coordination. It builds ships, orbitals, habitats, interventions, archives, and galaxy-spanning projects. It has contact and special circumstance agencies, which is also arguably its escape valve for its equivalent to the restless problem children, using them as alien ambassadors and agents. It has social structures, reputational systems, voluntary associations, and minds making decisions with consequences for civilizations. The functions of a megacorp survive: logistics, planning, construction, exploration, resource allocation, strategic action. But the form changes. The profit motive dies, or at least wanders off embarrassed, and the coordination continues under another name. That may be the long-term answer. Megacorps may not rule the stars forever. They may be transitional organisms, useful during eras when capital is scarce, infrastructure is hard, labor is expensive, and risk must be priced. As abundance increases, they may mutate into guilds, trusts, cooperatives, public utilities, AI-managed foundations, sheltered habitats, exploration leagues, or voluntary polities. The logo may remain, but the thing behind it changes. Things may tend to go in phases too, returning to corporations in cycles. And of course, even in post-scarcity, not everything becomes abundant. Prime locations remain scarce, trust remains scarce, attention remains scarce. Original art, historical continuity, political legitimacy, unique ecosystems, ancient artifacts, and the right to make irreversible decisions remains scarce. Someone still decides whether to terraform a moon, move an asteroid, awaken a dormant AI, seed an ocean, or launch a colony fleet that will found a civilization beyond recall. Megacorporations in space might eventually control mines, habitats, transportation networks, or worlds. But if civilizations someday learn to reach beyond our universe, perhaps delving too greedily and too deep, then even the laws of physics themselves could become resources. That's one possibility we explore in Outsider Aliens. A neighboring universe might have properties ours lack, making it a laboratory, refuge, energy source, or resource frontier for a civilization able to cross between realities. Of course, they might look at our universe exactly the same way. Outsider Aliens is out now exclusively on Nebula, alongside our Alien Life collection and years of SFIA exclusives, extended editions, and bonus content. Nebula is creator-owned, and every SFIA episode premieres there early and ad-free. Use my link or the QR code to get 50% off an annual plan, just $30 for the whole year. So perhaps the question is not whether megacores will exist in space. Some version of them almost certainly will if markets and private capital survive. The question is what they own, what they are allowed to own, how easily people can leave, how transparent their power is, and whether society treats them as tools or lets them become masters. Space will need builders. It will need investors, engineers, insurers, haulers, miners, farmers, habitat designers, lawyers, accountants, repair crews, and people willing to bet enormous sums on futures they may never personally see. Some of those builders will be corporations, some may be megacorporations, some may do heroic work, making the impossible routine and the frontier livable. Others may remind us why science fiction keeps putting skulls under the polished floor of the executive lobby. The future probably does not belong solely to governments or corporations or communes, or AIs, or noble houses with suspiciously dramatic capes. It will likely be an ecosystem of institutions, each good at some things and dangerous in others. And in a galaxy of possibilities, we should expect many different flavors across space and time. But wherever humans go, we should remember one simple principle. If someone owns or controls the only airlock, the only reactor, the only farm, and the only ship home, then it matters very much what sort of institution they are.